Hello everyone, I'm Hui Ying, a sports psychologist from SSI. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like you to know that there's a Q&A function right at the bottom of the screen so that you can type your questions if you have any later on during the session. So, with Tokyo 2021 coming up, it's important that athletes stay on top with both their mental and physical strength. Today, we have with us Mr. Kelvin Chua, who will be sharing more about what he does with the athletes he works with. Serving as a strength and conditioning coach at the Singapore Sports Institute, Kelvin is involved in the physical preparation of athletes, including archery, fencing, para-archery, and water polo. He also earned a master's degree in sports science and is an accredited certified strength and conditioning specialist under the National Strength and Conditioning Association. Without further ado, welcoming Mr. Kelvin.
A very good morning and thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Kelvin and I've been with the Singapore Sports Institute as a strength conditioning coach for the past 3 years. My topic today is on strength training modalities and practical application for sport performance. Here, I'll share some of the common strength training modes and provide practical examples as to how they are used in training with some of our athletes. Before diving into the different training modalities, let's briefly understand what strength training does. We do know that the various benefits strength training has on our musculoskeletal health. This is no different for athletes, of which these improvements will help them achieve their goals to be fitter, faster, and stronger. The role of strength training in sport is firstly to maximize sport performance. There has been a body of literature drawing good relationship between absolute strength, for example, how much weight one can lift, and functional performances such as sprints, jumps, and change of direction time, indicating the role strength plays in sporting pursuit. Secondly, strength training aids in the reduction of sport injuries. Findings by Lawson and colleagues provided evidence as to how that was achieved. Compared with modalities such as stretching and proprioception work, the integration of strength training reduced sport injuries as well as overuse injuries. Improvement in strength function could be explained through a couple of factors. Firstly, it could be due to changes in muscle morphology. Here, I'm talking about changes in your muscle cross-sectional area, your pronation angles, your fascicle length and thickness, as well as orientation of sarcomeres. This giving rise to mechanisms such as better storage and utilization of elastic energy. Secondly, it can be through neuromuscular adaptations. Here, I'm talking about motor unit recruitment, your firing frequency, as well as synchronization. All this contributing to improved force production and early rate of force development, which can be vital for sport performance. This is no surprise that strength training has become increasingly popular in recent decades and is now an important component in training for most sports as well as for injury mitigation and rehabilitation purposes. Therefore, the aim of this presentation is to share through the different training modalities and how they are used in practical settings. What you see here is a squat exercise. And what you now see are the many different variations that one can execute to work on different elements, improving lower limb strength and power. So here you can see that they can be the same exercise, but when done with different methods and approaches, it brings about varying neuromorphological adaptations. For instance, doing a ballistic jump will work on neurological adaptations such as an increase in rate of force development, while doing a time eccentric will provide morphological changes such as sacromerogenesis in series. To better understand this, let us first take a look at how movement occurs. Movements in general are classified according to the change in muscle length, or termed as muscle contraction. They may be static or dynamic in nature. The static mode involves isometric muscle action, whereby muscle develops force, but no external movement occurs and the length of muscle tendon complex does not change. Take pushing into a wall as an example. You literally cannot move the wall. The dynamic mode involves isotonic muscle action, which includes eccentric and concentric movements. During eccentric muscle action, muscle produces force while lengthening, while during concentric muscle action, the muscle produces force while shortening. Take the example of doing a bicep curl exercise. The bicep muscles shorten as you bend your elbow and lengthen as you straighten your elbow. Taking all of this into consideration, we also have to understand how this muscle movement can contribute to sport performance. For that, we have to look at the force and velocity relationship during muscle contraction. This graph shows the force and velocity relationship during muscle contraction. The vertical axis is represented by the force, and the horizontal axis shows the velocity component. Let's have a look at this graph in two separate portions, the concentric and eccentric portions. On the right half of the graph shows the concentric muscle action. Here, force and velocity has an inverse relationship. High forces are produced at low velocity. On the left half of the graph shows the eccentric muscle action. Here, force and velocity has an opposite relationship than concentric muscle action. We generally can produce more force eccentrically than concentrically. This explains why sometimes we can lower a very heavy amount of weight down, especially say during a squat exercise or bench press exercise, but can't push the weight back up. Focusing now on just the concentric portion of the force velocity curve, let's have a look at what this means for sport performance. Exercises such as sprinting and jump training will have very high velocity muscular contraction but low potential force production, while heavy lifting exercises will require high force production capacity at lower velocities. While training for sport performance, our objective is to train athletes to be stronger and faster. In essence, we're generally looking to shift the force velocity curve up and towards the right. The type of training modality may provide different stimulus and task-varying adaptations such as changes in muscle morphology or neuromuscular adaptations, which can increase force and/or velocity characteristics. Let's now delve into the different training modalities. Many who train regularly are not familiar with this technical term isotonic. However, most are familiar with the actual practice of isotonic exercises. Isotonic training refers to dynamic exercises whereby muscles exert a constant tension across a movement. In layman terms, this means moving a free weight or fixed weight as part of weight training. Isotonic muscle action consists both an eccentric and concentric contraction, which essentially forms the basis of movements, whether in our daily activities or sporting movements. Isotonic training comes in different forms, from bodyweight training to the use of free weights with loaded implements such as dumbbells, barbells, kettlebells, and the many other variations that free weight offers. Due to convenience and accessibility, bodyweight training is one of the most basic modalities that has been used by many. In fact, this was a predominant mode used for training during the coronavirus lockdown period just a few months back. While training with limited equipment, training variables and methods had to be adjusted to make sessions sufficiently effective to reduce detraining effects during the lockdown period. Like any training methods, bodyweight training has its limitations. While it's a good method for improving relative strength and strength endurance characteristics, it is very challenging to provide overload stimulus that can transfer to absolute strength and power characteristics necessary for sport performance. Nonetheless, bodyweight exercises should be prescribed to enhance basic strength level of novice athletes, such as working on fundamental movement patterns, before progressing to other training modes that might result in greater strength and power adaptations. Two other common groups that fall under isotonic category are your machine-based and free weight training. Machine-based training generally allows for the isolation of specific muscle groups, which can be important from a rehabilitation standpoint. That is the reason why machine-based or even free weight isolation training are often adopted to focus on targeted tissue capacity development. However, athletic movements are generally explosive in nature and rarely include muscle actions performed in an isolated manner. Exercises that incorporate multiple muscle groups may be more of an ideal training alternative for developing strength and power characteristics essential in sport. In addition, free weight exercises also recruit muscle stabilizers to a greater extent than machine-based exercises. On top of that, multi-joint exercises require greater coordination and muscle recruitment demands that might produce greater strength, power adaptation with which has greater transference to sport performance. Ultimately, the mode chosen will very much be dependent on the group you're working with. For instance, I'm working with para-archers, and at times, machine-based training will work a lot better for them. Here are some recommendations for strength training, whether you're using machine-based or free weights training. For training for sport performance, it is also useful to perform each repetition with a fast intent to work on rate of force development, which is essential in most sporting activities. We next take a look at other means of training. During a concentric action, the muscle produces force while shortening, initiating movements. Traditionally speaking, most training methods will emphasize on the concentric phase of a dynamic movement. The fact is that most performance measures depends on how much one can concentrically lift, as in a 1 repetition maximum test, or how much peak force can be produced in a force platform, say example jump test. The reason for this focus could be due to a greater neural activation as compared to eccentric contraction, which will potentially transfer to improved performance in sports, making this an essential training mode for athletes. Here are examples of our national fencers working on concentric-only lifts. Very often in fencing, attacks involve an immediate and explosive lunge. Exercises here focus on the concentric portion, eliminating pre-stretching of your muscles, which forces the neuromuscular system to recruit more motor units and also more rapidly. In addition, this is a method that's commonly used as a deloading or tapering strategy, whereby we want to keep the intensity high while keeping the body fresh. Using concentric-only method aids to maintain a training stimulus. Here, we are also targeting training on both ends of the force velocity curve to work on force production capability as well as accelerative abilities. All objectives here are achieved with a reduction in stress on the body, possibly due to the elimination of eccentric lengthening, which is known to cause delayed onset muscle soreness. During eccentric lengthening, the muscle serves to function. First, as brakes to slow down or stop rapid movements. Second, to store and convert energy to make work more efficient or powerful. When trained, it induces muscle hypertrophy with an increase in type 2 muscle cross-sectional area. This is due to its preferential recruitment during eccentric muscle actions. Changes in muscle architecture were also commonly observed mainly through an increase in fascicle length via sarcomere in series. This increases contractile velocity of muscles and extensibility, allowing more force production at longer lengths. Training this component has bearings not just on performance, but also in terms of injury mitigation, and hence should be properly planned with a periodized program. At the starting phase of a training, time eccentrics is a method commonly used to improve strength and the main lifts, such as your squat, bench, or pulls. It is done with time duration down, putting the muscles under tension, as well as enhancing neuromuscular control and movement coordination. As previously mentioned, eccentric exercises can produce greater force, about 20 to 50%, than concentric or isometric actions. So for a more well-trained athlete, it is possible to include eccentric-only exercises such as supramaximal eccentrics or negatives at the end of a normal set to overload the tissues. Weights can range from 110% to 130% of 1 repetition maximum, done from 1 to 3 repetitions with 4 to 6 seconds lowering for lifts when you perform the negatives. Eccentric training is also known to induce muscle damage and delay onset muscle soreness, especially when it's performed at high intensity and or for long duration. However, when the duration, frequency, and intensity are progressively increased, muscle damage can be minimized and even avoided. How explosive an athlete is will depend on how well he or she can eccentrically absorb the force before rapidly applying it to be an explosive and dynamic movement. Before the latter can be achieved, it is first important to train the body's ability to eccentrically absorb forces. This is what the drop land training does. Dropping from height increases impact momentum while landing, forcing the lower limbs to contract and absorb large forces eccentrically. This serves to build the base for subsequent training, which can help in the transfer of rapid forces required for sport performance. In the case of overhead movements such as a shot in water polo or a smash in badminton, the back and shoulder muscles need to be structurally strong enough to decelerate these rapid movements repeatedly. Here are weighted and bended variations of shoulder eccentric training to help the strengthening of the structural muscles as part of prehabilitation. Reps are typically done with 5 to 8 second lowering and range from 3 to 5 repetitions. Previously described were the concentric and eccentric muscle actions. However, in sport settings, movements seldom occur in isolated fashion. Most sporting movements require one to exert force in rapid manner, such as executing a jump smash in badminton or a sudden change in direction in fencing. This movement utilizes the muscle stretch shortening cycle or SSC component. SSC can be best described as a spring-like mechanism. Compressing the coil causes it to rebound, the compression representing an active stretch in the muscles, while the subsequent recoil illustrating immediate shortening contraction of the muscle to produce power. Plyometric training is a common tool used to train the SSC component in this case. Here, plyometric exercises work to train the muscle stretch shortening cycle to generate power. Across the literature, plyometric training has shown to improve performances in vertical jump, sprint times, and change of direction. It is likely that plyometric training provides neuromorphological adaptations, giving rise to an increase in muscular pre-activity, this allowing muscles to continue to fire to produce force, and an increase in muscle tendon stiffness, this contributing to better stretch shortening cycle function, which essentially allows for improved storage and transfer of elastic energy. The goal of plyometric training is to work on an athlete's ability to absorb great amount of force, effectively utilizing and transmitting these forces into powerful movements rapidly. To do so, we have to build muscle and tissue capacity through high impact work with longer ground contact time, such as the drop landing, as previously discussed, then subsequently progressing work towards rechanneling the impact forces into explosive takeoffs by increasing the number of ground contacts while reducing the contact time. An example would be a drop jump over a hurdle. For illustration, the following are some plyometric and ballistic activities based on ground contact time and the momentum upon impact. We do know that fencing is a sport that requires quick ground contact and often involves repeated forward and retreating movements. Therefore, plyometric training plays an important part in the fencer's program. Here, we have our national epee fencer working on a plyometric drill which focuses on low impact momentum with rapid ground contact time. And just like traditional resistance exercises, plyometric training needs to be progressed. Here is a progression from the double leg continuous hurdle hop. So basically, this is a single leg back and forth activity incorporating lateral hops, as shown here by our national forward fencer. After setting the base, training can be progressed into higher volume and intensity by increasing the number of contacts and or having added resistance such as ankle weights and or varying height of the hurdles, as shown here by our national forward fencer. Compared to the lower hurdle height, this increases momentum on impact, requiring the lower limbs to rapidly absorb and propel continuously forward. Also that in fencing, there's constant change in movement directions, inducing constant and rapid acceleration and deceleration. In this example, repeated jumping and dropping across boxes of different heights requires the body to constantly and very rapidly adjust body positioning, as well as absorbing and producing force to get from box to box. This in a way provides better transference to fencing movements. So what we know is that plyometric training places great demands on the musculoskeletal and nervous system. in that relevant tissues and the nervous system need to respond rapidly to quickly applied forces. Therefore, it is important to develop adequate strength base and a progressive plyometric training program to allow one to adapt to the demands placed on the system. In recent times, variations of the Olympic weightlifting exercises have been increasingly popular in use within strength conditioning programs. Compared to exercises such as the squat, which results in deceleration during later stages of the concentric phase, weightlifting variations are ballistic in nature, allowing one to accelerate throughout the concentric phase of movement. Here, weightlifting derivatives exploit both the force as well as velocity aspects of the force-velocity curve by moving moderate to heavy loads with ballistic intent. This makes them good tools for use during in-season. However, there is definitely a learning curve to this movement. Therefore, proper sequence planning is essential to get the most out of working with weightlifting variations. Weightlifting derivatives work to train the triple extension, which is the extension or straightening motion of your ankles, knees, and hips in sequence. And it happens during various sporting movements such as pushing off for fencing lunge or jumping for a smash. Variations can also be performed with dumbbells. Here, the single arm overhead split leg snatch was prescribed for fencer to work on movement coordination as well as a stable split leg landing, which is essential for fencing. Over here, we have another dumbbell variation performed by a water polo player working on rapid triple extension. Moving on, we next have variable resistance training. It uses accessories such as weight releases, chains, or bands to vary the load across range of motion of an exercise. With traditional resistance training, the external load remains constant. However, forces exerted by the muscles will vary in accordance to joint position. For example, during a heavy barbell back squat, one might find it really hard and challenging to come up from the bottom position. Bearing in mind that eccentric lengthening produces greater force compared to concentric contraction, using variable resistance as a training mean changes external resistance during exercise in order to maximize muscle force through range of motion. For example, in the back squat, the greatest muscle force production occurs at the top position of the movement, while the smaller forces are produced at the bottom. Here, variable resistance training is adopted with chains attached to the barbell, which loads up the top position where it's stronger and offsets weight at the bottom when it's relatively weaker. In this next example, we have our national cyclist doing a heavy squat during maximal strength training phase, working with weight that releases and detaches when she's at the bottom of the squat. Bearing in mind that these are also considered forms of eccentric training, but allows one to also work through the concentric portion of the lift. Another consideration is that during concentric effort of a movement, a large portion of time is spent decelerating. This method not only overcomes mechanical disadvantages, it may also provide for compensatory acceleration, providing greater explosive efforts. Here, we have our national sprinter working on a banded quarter squat variation nearing the final preparation stages. The usage of bands requires her to work on forceful lower limb drive to complete a repetition. Now on to the next method. Complex training is a method that alternates between a high load weight training exercise, such as a barbell back squat, with a mechanically similar light load ballistic exercise, such as a box jump, set for set. This high load exercise causes acute neurophysiological responses, one of which being an increase in motor neuron excitability, and this increases muscle contractile function, giving rise to post-activation performance enhancement, or PAPE effect. This PAPE effect provides a more optimal performance in the following ballistic exercise. Based on a recent review by Cormier and colleagues, complex training is found to be effective for improving performance-based parameters such as lower body absolute strength, the vertical jump height, sprint performance, as well as change of direction ability. Adaptations are likely due to combination of loads that stimulate different areas of the force velocity curve. It appears that this method is also more effective for higher level or stronger athletes, and that more than 6 weeks is necessary to see meaningful improvements in sport performance. Sub-maximal loads of less than 85% of 1 RM are also recommended, especially during in-season, as it provides an optimal yet safe approach for training. Here are some examples of complexes matching heavy bulk resistant exercises with a mechanically similar ballistic exercise. Practically, it is also important to take note of rest time in between the complexes. The high resistance activity not only induces potentiation, but also causes fatigue. With short rest intervals, fatigue may dominate and reduce the ability to potentiate. However, this window of opportunity differs between individuals and should be varied. In recent times, isometric training has become increasingly popular and can be a viable mode of strength training. During an isometric muscle action, muscle develops force, but no external movement occurs and the length of muscle tendon complex does not change. Compared to dynamic strength training, isometric training has shown to result in superior angle-specific strength, and improvements in sport performance were also observed in dynamic sports such as swimming, running, and cycling. This in part might be due to morphological adaptations such as increased muscle mass and improved tendon qualities, as well as neurological adaptations such as increase in rate of force development. Isometric training can be classified into two categories. First, we have yielding isometrics. Examples are the different plank variations, your wall seats, holding a push-up position. These activities involve submaximal muscular contraction and are hence commonly used to improve muscular endurance. Here, the nature of archery requires athletes to hold still and steady against environmental conditions such as the wind. Yielding isometric exercises are therefore usually prescribed at the end of a session to work on muscular endurance. In addition, long duration span at training requires archers to have good local muscular endurance. Here, our compound archer works on an isometric hold on the bow arm with an isotonic lateral raise on the draw arm to improve work capacity. To make things more challenging, we can introduce perturbations while one is in an isometric position. Here, I have my colleague working this variation with our national sailor, who needs to hold a good, strong position while maintaining control of his boat. The second method here is overcoming isometric. This involves trying to move an immovable object with relative effort. This method can be useful to improve force production, specifically at the most mechanically disadvantaged joint position of a particular movement, for example, a bottom of a squat or out of a starting block for sprints. Here, we have our kayakers executing isometric exercises at joint angles similar to the initiation of a pull phase of a kayak stroke. Each repetition is explosively performed and held for 3 seconds at maximal effort. So essentially here, we are working on the force production capacity as well as to develop neuromuscular adaptation to produce force rapidly. Isometric training can also be useful for athletes who are having limited mobility due to injuries or post-surgery. Currently, I'm working with a water polo player who's recovering from a hip injury. The objective is to work on lower limb strength endurance and hip range of motion to allow for optimal in-water stability, which requires great hip range of motion, as seen here in the in-water 8-meter kick. The work started out from doing an isometric squat at shorter muscle lengths, with sustained contractions range from 3 to 15 seconds, with a gradual ramping of intensity from 30% all the way to 70%. The plan here is to increase that contraction and duration intensity, then progressing this position into a lower squat, inducing longer muscle lengths to replicate in water positions once he feels comfortable. Isometric training, like other modes of resistance exercise, should be executed in a way that closely relates to the primary outcome objective. When muscular hypertrophy or maximal strength is the focus, evidence demonstrates that there's little difference between contractions completed with a ballistic or a gradual ramp to the prescribed intensity. However, if rapid force production is of importance, as it would in most sports, then isometric contractions should be performed as hard and as fast as possible in an explosive manner. With that said, isometric training might not be suitable for improving activities that utilize the stretch shortening cycle component. Therefore, it is recommended that isometric strength training be performed in concurrent with dynamic strength exercises. To sum up, training methods provided here are by no means exhaustive, but covers most of the popular training modalities that are practically in use. This table by Schuckmel and colleagues provides a gauge as to how various resistance training methods rank from a scale of low potential to high potential. As practitioners, it is important to understand intended use of each training method and prescribe them accordingly to phases within the group that we are working with. As previously discussed, the same exercise when performed with different intent and/or method induces varying adaptations. It is not just what exercise you use, the intent behind how you do them makes a huge difference too. In essence, the best program is the one that works. Understanding your athletes will allow you to plan one that sets them up for success. Thank you so much for listening to the end. To end off, I'd like to thank the Singapore Sport Institute for giving me this opportunity to share my work. Many thanks to also my colleagues for their ideas and feedback to make this work possible. Lastly, to all athletes and coaches whom I'm working with, thank you for putting the trust in my work. Feel free to contact me through any of these mediums. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your symposium.
Thank you so much, Kelvin, for bringing us through this how muscles are trained and the different types of strength training. I also love that there's various videos provided that allows us to visualize each variation. I'm also intrigued at why isotonic training is called as such. Does it function like isotonic drinks? So anyway, if you think you have better questions, feel free to add them down into the Q&A box right below. Type your questions in and introduce yourself. So Kelvin, I actually have a question, and I think some of our audiences also have something similar. So first of all, you mentioned like progressive and derivatives. It sounds like it's very dependent on many factors. So my question is, what are your recommendations on the training structure? And also bringing in from our audience, somebody also mentioned how often should strength training be done per week, and should it be done with high intensity interval trainings? And also Mr. Kunalan mentioned something similar in that what's the minimum number of training sessions? So I think all this is relevant to like the structure that's needed for training.
Hi, Hui Ying. Thanks for the questions. Again, I guess these are very much context-dependent question. I believe team who really did a great job in the previous presentation covered most of the stuff generally. Most of our stuff are pretty much overlapping a little as well. So a little more practical aspects of things, like what we are doing basically here in SSI as well. So maybe just to share a little, because if you're talking about training strategy recommendation, I say it's more of like context dependent, because again, I sum up by saying the methods used will very much be dependent on the athletes that you're kind of working with as well. And then the training frequency per week as well will depend on how much availability the athlete has in terms of working in the gym, a strength conditioning setting. So essentially, maybe what I can do is just provide like a rough outline gauge. So in terms of recommendation for maybe novices, maybe for somebody who is new, who is less trained, it may already be enough to get good benefits from, I guess, bodyweight exercises, machine-based exercises, as well as your traditional resistance exercises. And then I guess for more advanced athletes, people with more training age, in this case, using traditional lifting, traditional resistance exercises, incorporating novel methods like your variable resistance training, your complex training, for instance, may allow for greater training stimulus. Then again, it will also be dependent on which part of the preparation they are in. So in this case, because this pretty much has bearings on training focus. So for here, if let's say we're talking about off-season preparation in this case, maybe a little bit more focus on your eccentric training. This will help to build maybe your workload capacity, and then on top of your isotonic traditional free weight exercises. Then maybe for in-season, what you can work with is to build on to improve strength power abilities as required for most sports by maybe incorporating your traditional weightlifting exercises on top of maybe weightlifting derivatives and things like that. And then maybe for the more advanced, you can put in, again, your complex exercises, as well as your variable resistance training, just again to provide the training overload, the stimulus overload basically. And then maybe you're trying to do a taper, a deload, concentric only training, weightlifting, pulling derivatives, and maybe isometric work as well might help to allow the athlete to work on that real force development kind of aspects. Yeah, hope that answered the question a little. Not very comprehensive, but again, like I said, it's very much context dependent.
So from what I'm hearing you say, correct me if I'm wrong, this can actually be used for athletes who are just beginning out and even for those who are elite and competing internationally, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there, yes.
Okay, and also what I heard is that it really depends on the needs and how comfortable each athlete is also like, with the different kind of trainings.
Yeah, exactly. It really depends on their training age as well and how much experience they have within a gym setting.
Yeah, and it's always important to have someone to guide them there, right? Especially if you're novice in that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. We also have another question from one of our audience. I hope I got your name right. Sarah. She asks, could you elaborate more on RFD? And can this be used for reaction time improvements during the starts for runners and swimmers?
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. RFD in this case is rate of force development. It's just an indication of how much force you can apply. So basically for athletes, what we want to do is to have them be explosive. So we want them to be able to produce a great amount of force in the shortest amount of time. Essentially, we want them to be explosive. In this case, if let's say you're talking about reaction time, so I would say this is more of like a different component. So over here, reaction time, we're talking about the ability to kind of react. So it's more of like a cognitive ability for them to be maybe react to a stimulus in this case. And then of course, if let's say you're talking about sprinting, I think both are essential, but these are separate elements to be trained. So the reaction component of things and the rate of force component of things, which when you pair them together, I think will have great benefits to the sport that you're trying to work with. In this case, sprinting, the start of the sprint of the blocks. Hope that answered the question a little.
So as you're talking about that, it sounds like it's a lot of the sports that you gave examples on, like fencing and also sprinting and badminton. There's a lot of like fast movements or like fast strokes, fast force. But then just my own question actually, what about sports such as diving? How will it be as relevant?
Diving, you're talking about the one standing on the platform diving.
Yeah, the one from on top then you jumped.
Yeah, I guess it's I would say it's pretty much sport dependent in a way. So I have my colleague working with divers. So essentially it's a lot of it depends on the phase again, depends on the phase that they are kind of working with as well, because this has bearings on the training focus. So a part of training might work with the isometric component, because more of them, they kind of start in maybe a starting position without that stretch shortening component. So a lot of that, maybe they start off in a handstand position that requires them to be really stable, still. And then it really depends on what kind of event they are involved in, and then how we can use these different training methods to adapt to prepare them better for their event itself. Hope that answered the question a bit.
Yes, it did. It did. It just sounds like actually it can be relevant to all kinds of sports. Now that you answered, yeah.
I mean, because what I covered was pretty much on strength training methods. Again, I guess if let's say, I mean, as what Tim has talked about, essentially the goal is to be strong. I mean, it doesn't hurt being strong. So essentially, strength is the foundational ability of all other abilities, basically. So getting it doesn't hurt being strong, and these are actually the methods available to help you achieve that goal of being strong. But with that said, Tim also pretty much sum up to say that there are methods that the less trained, the more of the novice people can work with. And then there are also advanced methods that will provide like a novel stimulus so that people with advanced training age, they can still improve as well. Yep.
Okay. I think I'll take one more question, maybe a quick one. So Hang Guan, I hope I got your name right. He asked, how do you apply strength training in my school basketball players? Maybe you can give like 1 or 2 illustrations on how to do that.
School basketball player. Okay, I will assume that is in the local context. So I will assume that they have a they probably will have minimal exposure to strength training. So I would say that people of that age group, again, is pretty much context dependent. So I have to assume many variables as well. So here, assuming that they are kind of less trained, more novice, I would pretty much work more with body weight setting. So in this case, trying to get them really good at foundational movement patterns like your squat, push, pull in the horizontal and vertical planes, as well as your hinge, lunge, and carry patterns basically. So working these foundational movement patterns with just the body weight itself will build up the strength capacity or workload capacity for such individuals that can probably set a good path for them to perform better within their sport itself. And then again, if let's say you're talking about basketball, there are elements of this explosive elements involved, your stretch shortening cycle. So there might be essential to put in plyometric exercises here and there. Again, progression is really important. So starting off with lower impact to maybe higher impact trainings, dependent on your athletes and how they respond to the training. So I guess these are just pretty much just a gauge of a recommendation. So happy to chat with that. Yeah, further.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kelvin, for answering the questions and the audiences for the questions. Definitely, he's right in that there's no harm in being stronger. So with that, we'd like to thank Mr. Kelvin once again. And also, we hope to get your feedback. So we'll be very appreciative if you can complete the QR code shown on the screen